The words came out flat and measured, the way they always did when First Sergeant Mary Henderson spoke about practical matters, which was nearly always. She stood there holding that massive ladle, the kind that could serve a dozen men in under a minute, and she gestured with it toward the assembled women who sat in rows beneath the glaring electric lights strung up along the canvas ceiling of the mess tent. "What a waste," she said again, shaking her head slightly, her expression revealing nothing more than mild disapproval at the inefficiency of it all. The women she indicated were German, every single one of them, and their faces carried that particular pallor that comes not just from fear, but from months of uncertainty, from the grinding anxiety of not knowing what comes next. The lights overhead were harsh, unforgiving, the kind that made everyone look slightly ill, and under that illumination the women appeared almost spectral. It was the 3rd day of August in 1945, a date that would mean nothing to most people but which hung in the air of that particular place with a strange weight. Outside the tent, beyond the flaps that had been tied back to allow what little breeze existed to circulate through the stifling interior, the last flames of the most destructive war in human history were finally sputtering out. The news that reached them spoke of surrender, of occupation, of a world trying to figure out what came after the unimaginable. But here, in this converted field on the outskirts of Allentown, Pennsylvania, a different kind of conflict had taken root, one that was quieter, stranger, and in its own way just as intractable as anything that had happened on the battlefields of Europe. Fort Deschler had never been meant to be a permanent installation. It was one of those places that appeared during wartime out of sheer necessity, thrown together with astonishing speed, a collection of hastily erected buildings and tents surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. The designation was somewhat misleading since it suggested a military fortification of some historical significance, but in truth it was simply an internment facility for enemy non-combatants, one of several scattered across the American interior. The population here was unique, though, different from the other camps that held captured soldiers or relocated citizens. Fort Deschler housed more than 400 German women, and they presented their own particular challenges. Most of these women had served in something called the Helferinnen, which was the Communications Auxiliary Corps. They had worked as radio operators, telephone technicians, cipher clerks, all the technical positions that a modern military requires to function. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, had never carried weapons or engaged in combat, but they had been captured nonetheless as the machinery of the Third Reich ground to its final catastrophic halt. Some had been taken when their installations were overrun, others had been rounded up in the chaos of collapse, and still others had simply been in the wrong place when the armies swept through. Now they were here, in rural Pennsylvania, thousands of miles from anything they had ever known, guarded and processed by a small detachment of the Women's Army Corps. The WAC unit assigned to Fort Deschler numbered fewer than 40, which meant each woman carried multiple responsibilities, worked long shifts, and dealt with situations for which their training had not fully prepared them. They were guards, administrators, translators, and now, apparently, they were also trying to be providers of sustenance to a group of people who seemed determined to reject it. The situation had been growing more tense with each passing day, and standing orders were becoming increasingly difficult to follow when the prisoners simply refused to cooperate with the most basic aspects of camp routine. In front of each German woman sat a metal tray, the standard army-issue kind with the divided sections to keep the different foods separate. These trays should have been empty by now, scraped clean and stacked for washing, but instead they remained full, virtually untouched. The food itself was remarkable, especially considering the rationing that still affected much of the civilian population back home. There were thick slices of roasted beef, the meat dark and glistening with its own juices, each portion easily 6 or 7 ounces. Beside the beef sat a generous mound of mashed potatoes, real potatoes mashed with milk and butter until they were smooth and creamy, with a crater in the centre that had been filled with rich brown gravy. The green beans had been cooked with bacon, giving them flavour and substance. There was a dinner roll, freshly baked that morning in the camp kitchen, still soft enough that you could press your thumb into it and watch it spring back. And then there was the pie, a wedge of apple pie with a flaky crust and a filling that smelled of cinnamon and sugar, the kind of dessert that represented American plenty in its most concentrated form. For most American civilians, even those who were relatively comfortable, this would have been considered a feast, the kind of meal you might expect on a holiday or special occasion. For prisoners of war, it should have been incomprehensible, a generosity so extreme it bordered on the absurd. But the trays sat there, cooling slowly, the gravy developing a skin on its surface, the green beans growing limp, the pie going from warm to room temperature. None of it had been eaten, not a bite had been taken, not a fork had been lifted. This was not, as Sergeant Henderson had initially suspected, some kind of organised protest. It was not a hunger strike designed to draw attention to conditions or make political demands. There was no defiance in the women's eyes, no hardness or determination. What was there instead was something far more troubling, something that resisted simple categorization or straightforward solution. It was fear, pure and uncomplicated and overwhelming. These women looked at the abundance spread before them and saw not generosity but deception. They looked at food that seemed too good to be real and concluded that it must be a trap. Years of carefully constructed propaganda had done its work. They had been told, repeatedly and emphatically, that the Americans were barbaric, that capture meant torture and death, that the enemy delighted in cruelty and would use any means necessary to inflict suffering. They had been fed these lies so consistently, for so long, that the lies had become indistinguishable from truth. The mental architecture that had been built in their minds over years of indoctrination could not simply be demolished by the sight of a hot meal. If anything, the meal itself was suspect precisely because it contradicted what they knew to be true. The logic was perverse, but internally consistent. Why would an enemy, particularly one as cruel as they had been told the Americans were, waste such valuable resources on prisoners? The only possible explanation was that the food was poisoned, that this was some kind of final test or elaborate sadism, that eating it would lead to agonizing death. Two questions hung in the humid, heavy air of that mess tent, questions that nobody had yet found satisfactory answers to. The first was simple enough from a logistical standpoint, but deeply puzzling from a psychological one. Why would an army that had just fought its way across an entire continent and an ocean, an army that was still engaged in brutal combat in the Pacific, why would such an army expend so much effort and so many resources on feeding its prisoners this well? It made no sense within the framework they had been taught to use for understanding the world. The second question was more practical, but no less difficult. What would it take to convince these women that the food was safe, that it was really just food, that accepting it would not lead to their destruction? What act or demonstration or argument could possibly bridge the gap between their indoctrinated paranoia and the mundane reality of an army mess hall? Lieutenant Anna Jacobs stood near the entrance to the tent, observing the scene with an expression that might have been mistaken for calm if you did not know her well enough to see the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers drummed once against her thigh before she forced them to be still. She was the executive officer for the camp, which meant she was responsible for the day-to-day operations, for making sure that the policies established by Captain Miller were actually implemented, for solving the 100 small problems that arose in any place where hundreds of people were confined together. She was barely 25 years old, which made her younger than some of the women she was guarding, but she carried herself with a careful authority that suggested she understood the weight of her position. Before the war, before she had taken a commission and put on the uniform, Jacobs had been a high school history teacher in a small town in Ohio. She had taught sophomores and juniors about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and the First World War, had tried to make those distant conflicts feel real and relevant to teenagers who were more concerned with football games and weekend dances. The teaching experience had taught her patience, had taught her how to manage a room full of restless young people, but nothing in those classrooms had prepared her for this. History, she was discovering, was far messier and more complicated when you were living through it rather than reading about it in a textbook. Her world had become one of rosters and supply requisitions and endless paperwork, of military regulations and protocol, of the careful bureaucracy that kept a camp like this functioning. She had read the Geneva Convention so many times that the pages of her personal copy had gone soft, the corners rounded, the text in some places faded from repeated handling. She knew exactly what was required in terms of prisoner treatment, knew the minimum standards for food and shelter and medical care, and she took those requirements seriously. More than seriously, actually. She had made them a kind of personal mission. She did not see the German women in her charge as enemies. Not really. Not in the visceral way that some of the other personnel did. She saw them as a problem to be solved, as a logistical challenge that could be addressed through American efficiency and proper procedure. Captain Miller, her commanding officer, was a different sort entirely. He was career Army, had been in uniform for nearly 20 years, had served in various posts both stateside and abroad. The war had been good for his career in some ways, had given him opportunities for advancement that peacetime service might not have provided, but it had also burdened him with responsibilities that were often contradictory and always stressful. He was facing the same pressures that were affecting officers across the entire military establishment as the machinery of war began the complicated process of winding down. There were not enough ships to transport everyone who needed transporting, not enough facilities to process everyone who needed processing, not enough clear guidance on what exactly should be done with the thousands and thousands of enemy civilians who had been swept up in the chaos of conquest. Miller had called Jacobs into his office 2 days earlier, had gestured brusquely at the chair across from his desk without bothering with pleasantries. The conversation had been brief and to the point. "Get them fed," he had said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had dealt with too many problems already that day and did not have patience for another one. "I don't care how you do it. I don't care what methods you use. Just get them to eat. We cannot have an incident here, not with the Red Cross scheduled to inspect next month. Those neutral observers show up and find a camp full of malnourished prisoners, and it becomes my problem. It becomes our problem. It goes in reports, it gets attention from people who have the power to end careers. So fix it." An incident, in the careful language of military bureaucracy, was a euphemism for anything that could generate negative attention. It could mean malnutrition, disease outbreaks, riots, escapes, deaths, any number of things that would reflect poorly on the camp administration. More specifically, an incident was anything that would be documented by external observers, particularly those from neutral countries who had the authority to inspect prisoner facilities and report on conditions. The Red Cross took its mandate seriously, and a report from them that indicated inadequate care or violations of international agreements would create exactly the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that could derail promotions and damage reputations. Miller had made it clear that he had no intention of allowing that to happen, and that meant the problem was now Jacobs to solve. The challenge, as Jacobs had quickly realized, was not a lack of resources. That was almost laughable, actually, given the circumstances. The quartermaster's depot that supplied Fort Deschler was overflowing with food, with supplies of every kind, with more abundance than seemed quite decent when you thought about the rationing that civilians back home were still enduring. The American military machine, once it had begun producing at full capacity, had turned out to be almost frighteningly efficient. There was no shortage of beef or potatoes, or flour, or sugar, or coffee, or any of the 1,000 other items that made up a proper military diet. The problem was not supply. The problem was perception. The prisoners were products of a system that had spent years glorifying sacrifice, that had turned privation into a virtue, that had made scarcity seem like noble austerity rather than the result of failed policies and collapsing infrastructure. They came from a place where butter and coffee and meat had become luxuries, where ration cards determined what you could eat and when, where hunger had become so normalized that abundance seemed unnatural. And they had been fed, both literally and figuratively, a steady diet of propaganda about American depravity. The enemy, they had been told over and over, was merciless. Defeat would mean starvation, torture, execution. The Americans, according to the world view that had been carefully constructed for them, were devils in human form, incapable of mercy or kindness or basic humanity. The reality they now faced was more terrifying than any fictional cruelty could have been, because it completely shattered the framework they had for understanding the world. If the enemy was not cruel, if the Americans were actually willing to feed them better than they had eaten in years, then what did that mean? It meant that everything they had been told was a lie. It meant that everything they had sacrificed for, every hardship they had endured, every loss they had accepted, had been in service of something fundamentally hollow. That kind of realization was not something people could accept easily. It was existentially destabilizing. It was easier, psychologically, to believe that the food was poisoned than to accept that their entire system of belief might have been fraudulent from the start. The first few days had established a pattern that seemed impossible to break. The WAC personnel would prepare the meals according to standard procedure, would serve them onto the trays, would carry those trays out to the long tables where the prisoners sat in rows. The German women would stare at the food, their expressions a complicated mixture of longing and terror and confusion. Some would pick at a roll, tearing off small pieces and eating them dry, as if that was the only safe option. Most would eat nothing at all, would simply sit there until the meal period ended and the trays were collected, still full, still virtually untouched. The waste was staggering, and it was getting worse. Sergeant Henderson, ever the pragmatist, had made her position clear multiple times. She had served stateside throughout the war, had spent 3 years managing supply depots and logistics operations, had developed a professional appreciation for efficiency and a personal distaste for waste. The sight of all that uneaten food being scraped into garbage bins was physically painful to her. "Sir," she had said to Jacobs, trying to keep her voice level and professional even though her frustration was evident, "with all due respect, we are dumping nearly 1,000 pounds of perfectly good food every single day. There are people back home, American citizens who fought for this victory, who would give anything for those potatoes, who would consider that beef a luxury they could have once a month if they were lucky. And we're just throwing it away because these women are too stubborn or too scared to eat it." Jacobs understood the frustration, shared it even, but she also saw the deeper dimensions of the problem. This was not really about food, not in any simple sense. This was about trust, or rather the complete absence of it. This was about the psychological aftermath of years of systematic lying, about the way propaganda could warp perception so thoroughly that even obvious truths became suspect. You could not solve that kind of problem with a memo or a direct order. You could not simply command people to trust you and expect it to work. Trust had to be built, carefully and deliberately, through actions rather than words. Jacobs had spent her first evening after Miller's ultimatum sitting in her quarters, a small room in one of the administrative buildings, thinking through possible approaches. She had her notes spread out on the narrow desk, had gone through her copy of the Geneva Convention yet again looking for guidance, had reviewed everything she knew about prisoner psychology and camp management. Nothing in the official guidance addressed this specific situation. The regulations told you how much food to provide and what minimum nutritional standards to meet, but they did not tell you how to convince people to actually eat that food when they were convinced it would kill them. The solution, she had finally concluded, could not come from a manual or a regulation or a directive from higher command. It had to be psychological, had to address the fundamental problem of perception rather than just the surface issue of food consumption. She needed to find a way to demonstrate, in a manner that could not be dismissed or explained away, that the food was exactly what it appeared to be. Nothing more, nothing less. Just food. She started by observing the prisoners more carefully during the following day's meals, paying attention not just to whether they ate, but to how they interacted with each other, who they looked to for guidance, who seemed to have informal authority within the group. Every human society develops hierarchies, develops leaders, whether officially designated or not, and understanding those informal power structures was crucial to understanding how to effect change. It did not take long to identify the key figure. Her name was Greta Fischer, and she stood out from the other prisoners in several ways. She was older, somewhere in her late 30s, which made her nearly 15 years older than many of the younger women who had served in the communications corps. She had been a radio supervisor in Berlin, had managed an entire facility full of operators and equipment, had held a position of real responsibility before everything collapsed. She carried herself with an air of authority that had survived captivity, a kind of weary competence that the other women clearly recognized and responded to. When there were questions about camp procedures or confusion about instructions, it was Greta who stepped forward to ask for clarification. When disputes arose among the prisoners, which they inevitably did when you had hundreds of stressed, frightened people confined together, it was often Greta who mediated. Her gaze was intelligent, careful, constantly assessing. She missed nothing, seemed to catalogue every detail of camp operations, every interaction with the American personnel. She spoke English reasonably well, certainly better than most of the other prisoners, with a slight accent that made her origins clear but did not impede understanding. That linguistic ability had made her a natural choice as a spokeswoman, someone who could serve as an intermediary between the prisoners and their captors. It was Greta who had first articulated clearly and explicitly what the prisoners feared. This had happened during one of the formal inspections that Jacobs conducted twice weekly, walking through the barracks to check on conditions and address any problems. Greta had asked to speak privately, had been escorted to one of the small offices used for administrative purposes, had sat across from Jacobs with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral. In Germany, Greta had said, speaking slowly and deliberately as if she wanted to make absolutely certain she was understood correctly, food like this is for the highest officers only. For generals, perhaps. For party officials at their banquets. It is not for ordinary soldiers, certainly not for prisoners, not for anyone, really. Not anymore, not after years of war. Everything has been rationed. Everything has been scarce. Everything has been carefully controlled. So this, she had gestured vaguely in the direction of the mess hall. This abundance you show us, it cannot be real. It cannot be what you say it is. This is a script, a performance, something designed to deceive. You want us to eat so that we become sick, so that you have your justification for whatever comes next. That is the only explanation that makes sense within our understanding of how the world works. Jacobs had listened without interrupting, had forced herself not to react defensively or dismissively. She understood that Greta was not being irrational, not really. She was being perfectly logical within the framework of information and experience she possessed. The problem was that the framework itself was fundamentally flawed, built on years of propaganda and distortion. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that something is not poisoned? How do you convince someone to take a leap of faith when that person's entire belief system has been constructed around the idea that such faith would be suicidal? Her first attempt at a solution had been straightforward, direct, the kind of approach that seemed like it should work if you thought about it logically. The next day, at the midday meal, she had arranged for a tray to be prepared for herself from exactly the same serving line that fed the prisoners. She made sure everyone could see that it came from the same pots, the same steam tables, that there was no separate preparation or special handling. Then she had walked deliberately to the centre of the mess hall, had positioned herself where every prisoner could see her clearly, and she had proceeded to eat the entire meal while they watched. She finished every bite of the beef, chewed and swallowed it methodically. She ate every spoonful of the potatoes, scraped up the last of the gravy with her dinner roll. She ate the green beans, ate the bread, and then, making a small deliberate show of enjoying it, she ate the entire wedge of apple pie, fork scraping against the tray to get the last crumbs of crust. The performance, if it could be called that, took perhaps 15 minutes. Sergeant Henderson had stood beside her throughout, arms crossed over her chest, her expression a mask of professional skepticism that suggested she thought this entire exercise was pointless but was willing to go along with her officer's orders. The prisoners had watched in complete silence, their faces unreadable, their eyes tracking every movement. When Jacobs finished, she placed her empty tray deliberately on the return rack, the same rack where everyone else was supposed to place theirs. She turned to face the room, making eye contact with as many of the women as she could. "It is just food," she had said clearly, speaking slowly to account for language barriers. "Nothing more than that, just food. You can eat it safely." Nothing changed. When the meal period ended and the trays were collected, they were just as full as they had been at any previous meal. The demonstration had failed completely. The prisoners had watched, had acknowledged what they saw, but had not believed it. The performance, no matter how sincere, was still perceived as exactly that, a performance. It was theatre designed to reinforce the deception rather than expose the truth. Within the logical framework that the prisoners were operating under, of course the camp commander would eat the food first. That was part of the script, part of the elaborate lie. It proved nothing. The failure forced Jacobs to completely reconsider her approach. Direct demonstrations of authority were not working. Commands were not working. Appeals to logic were not working. She needed something else entirely, some different key that could unlock this particular impasse. The answer came from an unexpected source. Corporal Patricia Davis was a young woman from a farm in Iowa, barely 20 years old, who had joined the WAC more out of a desire to escape rural life than out of any particular patriotic fervour. She had been assigned to kitchen patrol, which was widely considered one of the worst duty assignments in the camp, involving long hours of mind-numbing work, scrubbing pots and mopping floors and handling garbage. She performed her duties with grudging competence, but made no secret of her distaste for the work. Nevertheless, she was observant in the way that people who work with their hands often are, and she had developed her own theory about the food situation. "The problem, ma'am," Davis had said one evening while polishing an absolutely massive stock pot that was used for making soup, "is that everything is too perfect. It looks like something out of a magazine advertisement, like one of those pictures they use to sell kitchen appliances. It does not look real. It looks manufactured, artificial, like something from a film set rather than an actual meal that actual human beings would prepare and consume." That single offhand comment, made by a corporal who was more focused on finishing her work than on solving complicated psychological problems, turned out to be the spark that Jacobs needed. The food was mass-produced, efficient, impersonal, created by industrial processes in institutional kitchens. It was army food, prepared according to standardized recipes by trained cooks following established procedures. It was all perfectly uniform, perfectly controlled, perfectly impersonal. What if that uniformity, that perfection, was actually part of the problem? What if, instead of demonstrating abundance, it was actually reinforcing the prisoners' suspicions by seeming too good to be true? What if the solution was not to show them abundance, but to show them humanity? Not perfection, but imperfection. Not industrial efficiency, but something more personal, more authentic, more recognizably human. The idea crystallized in Jacob's mind with sudden clarity. She knew what she needed to do. The next day, Jacobs did not go to the mess hall to observe another failed meal. Instead, she went directly to the kitchen, that steaming, chaotic space where enormous pots bubbled and ovens roared and cooks moved with practiced efficiency through their routines. She walked in wearing her uniform, but also carrying an apron, which she proceeded to put on over her lieutenant's bars and insignia. The kitchen staff stopped what they were doing and stared at her with expressions of complete bewilderment. Officers did not cook. Officers certainly did not put on aprons and request access to ingredients and cooking equipment. Her request was simple but, to the career army cooks who staffed the facility, deeply strange and possibly insane. She asked for onions, several pounds of them, potatoes, a large quantity, flour, butter or rendered fat, some scraps of beef that were not quite good enough to serve as roasts but still perfectly edible. She asked for a large pot, one of the heavy cast-iron ones that could sit on a burner for hours without scorching its contents. She was not planning to prepare another elaborate army meal. She was going to make soup. Not an American soup from a standardized recipe card, not something that could be replicated in any kitchen anywhere according to precise measurements. She was going to make a German soup, specifically Kartoffelsuppe, a simple potato soup that she remembered from a trip to Germany with her family years before the war, when such travel was still possible and Germany was still just a country rather than an enemy. It was peasant food in the best sense of that term, the kind of meal you made from whatever you had on hand, from leftovers and scraps and ingredients that were cheap and abundant. It was humble, imperfect, fundamentally human. And it was unmistakably, authentically German. No propaganda could fake that. No script could reproduce it convincingly. The smell alone would be enough to trigger memories, would bypass all the intellectual defenses and speak directly to something deeper, more primal, more honest. She began by peeling the potatoes herself, using a small paring knife. Her movements awkward at first, as muscle memory from years ago slowly reasserted itself. The cooks watched with a mixture of amusement and bewilderment. Lieutenant Jacobs was not known for being eccentric, was in fact known primarily for being careful and methodical and by the book, which made this sudden departure from normal behaviour all the more confusing. She showed them how to chop the onions, not too fine, not into perfect uniform pieces, but just rough chunks that would cook down into sweetness. She demonstrated how to make a proper roux, browning flour in a little fat until it turned golden and developed that nutty aroma that would give the soup its body and depth. The smell began to fill the kitchen gradually, building in intensity as the onions caramelized and the flour toasted. It was entirely different from the industrial scents that normally dominated this space, different from the smell of steam tables and bulk meat roasting in enormous ovens. This was the smell of a home kitchen, the smell of someone cooking a meal rather than processing ingredients according to institutional requirements. It was earthy, savoury, deeply and fundamentally real in a way that transcended language or culture or politics. Captain Miller, who made it his business to know what was happening everywhere in his command, caught wind of this unorthodox experiment and came storming into the kitchen with his face set in what could only be described as thunderous disapproval. "Lieutenant," he barked, his voice loud enough to cut through the kitchen noise, "what in God's name do you think you are doing here? I gave you an assignment, gave you a problem to solve, gave you authority to fix this situation, and your solution is to open up some kind of private restaurant? This is not what I meant by solving the problem." Jacobs straightened up, still holding the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the soup, and she met her commanding officer's glare without flinching. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and professional, "with all due respect, what we have been doing for the past week is not working at all. It is a complete failure. We are wasting resources at an unacceptable rate, and we are making the situation worse with each passing day rather than better. The current approach is clearly not effective, so we have to try something different. This is not about appeasement or coddling or anything like that. This is psychology. This is about understanding why they are refusing to eat and addressing the actual source of their fear, rather than just commanding them to stop being afraid." Miller looked from Jacob's determined face to the pot of simmering soup, then to the perplexed expressions of his kitchen staff who had stopped their work to witness this confrontation. He was a man who valued results above everything else, who had risen through the ranks by being practical rather than ideological, by solving problems rather than adhering rigidly to procedure when procedure did not work. His patience with this particular problem had been exhausted days ago, but he could see the logic in what Jacobs was attempting, even if the method seemed unorthodox to the point of absurdity. "One day, Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice low and hard, "you get exactly one meal to prove that this is not just another waste of time and resources. One meal. If they do not eat this soup of yours, if this turns out to be just another failed experiment, then we go to absolute minimum rations. Bread and water until the Red Cross forces us to do otherwise. I will not have my command cited for wasteful practices. Is that absolutely clear? It was clear, painfully, frighteningly clear. The stakes were no longer just about solving an administrative problem or avoiding an incident. They were about the basic well-being of the women under her charge, about whether they would continue to receive adequate nutrition or be reduced to punitive rations. Jacobs knew that this was her only remaining chance to fix the situation before Miller's patience ran out completely. As the soup continued to simmer, filling the kitchen with its unmistakable aroma, Jacobs made another crucial decision. She could serve this soup in the mess hall the same way every other meal had been served, could have it ladled into bowls and placed in front of the prisoners, and hope that somehow this time would be different. But she did not think that would work. The mess hall itself had become associated with deception in the prisoners' minds. She needed to change the context entirely, needed to show them not just the result but the process, not just the food but the humanity behind it. She asked Sergeant Henderson to bring Greta Fisher to the kitchen. Not to some formal meeting room, not to the mess hall, but here, to the actual source of the food. She wanted Greta to see where it came from, how it was made, wanted to strip away the possibility that this was some kind of elaborate theatrical production. Henderson raised an eyebrow at the unusual request, but complied without argument, disappearing to retrieve the German spokeswoman. Greta entered the kitchen a few minutes later, flanked by Henderson, moving cautiously as if she expected some kind of trap. Her eyes immediately began scanning the room with that careful, assessing intelligence that characterized her, taking in every detail. The sacks of flour stacked against one wall, the bins of potatoes and onions, the uniformed American women working at various stations, the enormous pots bubbling on the industrial stoves. She had expected sterility, perfect military efficiency, a factory for producing food. Instead, she saw something that looked almost improvisational, almost domestic despite the industrial scale of the equipment. And then there was the smell. That was what stopped her, what made her freeze in place and close her eyes for just a moment. You cannot fake the smell of onions that have been properly caramelized, cannot manufacture the aroma of flour slowly browning in fat, cannot reproduce the exact scent of potatoes simmering with herbs. It was a smell that spoke directly to memory, that bypassed all conscious thought and all defensive skepticism. It was the smell of her mother's kitchen in Berlin on a cold winter evening 20 years ago. It was the smell of home, and home could not be faked. Jacobs had been watching for Greta's arrival, and now she moved deliberately to ladle a small amount of the soup into a simple ceramic bowl. She did not offer it directly to the German woman. Instead, in a piece of carefully staged theatre, she handed it to Sergeant Henderson. "Sergeant," she said formally, "please taste this and confirm whether there is any poison in it. Check it carefully." The order was absurd on its face, a completely unnecessary formality, but it was essential to the demonstration. Henderson, ever the consummate professional, took the bowl without comment, picked up a spoon, and took a small, careful sip. She paused, her expression remaining completely deadpan and unreadable. "It is potato soup, sir," she reported in her flat, practical voice. "It tastes exactly like potato soup. Nothing more, nothing less." Then Jacobs ladled another small bowl for herself. She held it close to her face for a moment, letting the steam warm her skin, and then she drank directly from the bowl, bypassing the spoon entirely, consuming a generous amount of the hot liquid. Only then did she ladle a third bowl, and this one she held out toward Greta without saying a single word. The offer hung in the air between them, an invitation rather than a command. The air in the kitchen was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of the soup and the weight of unspoken tension. The cooks had all stopped working to watch this strange scene unfold. Henderson stood silent and still, the empty bowl still in her hands. Jacobs held out the soup with her arm extended, patient, not pushing, just offering. Greta looked at the bowl, looked at the American lieutenant's face, which was now flushed from the heat of the steam, looked back at the cutting board where half-peeled potatoes still sat waiting to be added to the next batch. These were not props carefully arranged for a performance. These were just the ordinary detritus of cooking, too mundane and too random to be part of an elaborate deception. This was not a trick. This was not a script. This was just a woman making soup in a kitchen. Slowly, moving as if she were in a dream or underwater, Greta reached out and took the bowl. Her hands were trembling slightly, enough to make the surface of the soup ripple. She raised the bowl to her lips with deliberate care and took the smallest possible sip, barely enough to taste. Her eyes closed. For a long moment, perhaps 10 seconds that felt like minutes, she was completely still, frozen in place as if time itself had stopped. When her eyes opened again, they were wet with tears that had not yet fallen. She took another sip, this one deeper, more committed. A single tear broke free and traced a path down through the grime on her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She was entirely focused on the soup, on the taste of it, on the memories it was triggering, on the cognitive dissonance of finding something familiar and safe in this place that should have been hostile and dangerous. She finished the entire bowl, and the silence in the kitchen was broken only by the sound of ceramic against her lips and the quiet noise of her swallowing. When she lowered the empty bowl, she looked at Jacobs with an expression that was complex beyond words, grief and relief and dawning realization all mixed together. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of understanding. "Thank you," she said in English. It was more than a polite acknowledgement. It was a surrender, but not a surrender to American military power or superior force. It was a surrender to simple, undeniable, overwhelming humanity. It was an acknowledgement that she had been lied to, that her entire framework for understanding reality had been fundamentally flawed. That evening's dinner service was different from every other meal that had been served at Fort Deschler since the prisoners arrived. There were no trays laden with roast beef and pie. There were no perfect portions carefully measured and arranged. Instead, there were simply large, steaming terrines of Kartoffelsuppe placed at intervals along each long table, along with baskets of plain bread. The WAC personnel served it family-style, ladling the thick, fragrant soup into bowls as the prisoners passed them forward. Jacobs and Henderson stood at the back of the mess hall, watching carefully, saying nothing. For the first few moments after the soup was served, the prisoners simply looked at it, their expressions unreadable. The familiar aroma was filling the space, triggering memories they had tried to bury, reminding them of times before the war, before the propaganda, before everything had become twisted and uncertain. Then one woman, a young blonde who worked in the laundry detail, picked up her spoon with a hand that shook slightly. She dipped it into the soup, brought it to her mouth, and tasted it. Her eyes widened slightly. She took another spoonful, this one without hesitation. The woman beside her saw this and followed suit. Then another and another, until the ripple effect spread across the entire hall. Soon the space was filled with the quiet, rhythmic sound of spoons against bowls, of people eating with a focus and intensity that spoke to profound hunger, not just physical, but emotional, not just for food, but for something real and trustworthy in a world that had proven itself fundamentally untrustworthy. They ate every last drop. Every single bowl was emptied, and many women went back for second servings when offered. The terrines were scraped clean. The bread was consumed entirely. And then, as the bowls were being cleared and the tables wiped down, Jacobs had arranged for one more thing to be served. Coffee. Not the weak ersatz substitute made from roasted grains that had become standard in wartime Germany, not the pale brown liquid that tasted vaguely like burnt toast and was called coffee only out of desperate optimism. This was real coffee, rich and dark and strong, brewed from actual coffee beans, one of those luxuries that the American military still had in abundance, while the rest of the world made do with substitutes. As the women sipped the hot, bitter liquid, something fundamental broke inside them. It started with just a few quiet sniffles, individual women trying to contain their emotions and failing. Then the sniffles became soft sobs. Within minutes, the entire mess hall was filled with the sound of weeping, hundreds of women crying simultaneously. But these were not tears of sadness or grief for their military defeat. These were not tears of despair or fear. These were tears of catharsis, tears of profound release, the overwhelming emotional response to having their entire worldview shattered in a single evening. The abundance was real. The enemy's humanity was real. Everything they had been told, everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had believed about how the world worked, had been a lie. That realization was devastating in a way that defeat alone could never be. It meant that the hardships had been unnecessary, that the suffering had been for nothing, that they had been used and manipulated by people they had trusted. The truth was more painful than any physical wound, but it was still truth, and there was something cleansing about finally facing it. One young woman, barely 20 years old, her face still soft with adolescence despite everything she had been through, looked up at Corporal Davis as the corporal moved down the table, refilling coffee cups. Tears were streaming down the young woman's face, but she was smiling, a strange, complicated smile that contained pain and relief in equal measure. "This is," she said in halting English, searching for the right words, "this is the best meal I have ever eaten in my entire life. It was not about the soup. It was not about the bread or the coffee. It was about what those things represented. It was about truth piercing through layers of deception. It was about the moment when propaganda collapsed under the weight of undeniable reality. The meal itself was simple, humble even, but it had accomplished what all the orders and commands and demonstrations of authority could not. It had created trust where none had existed, had built a bridge across the gap between captor and captive, had reminded everyone involved that beneath the uniforms and the politics and the history, they were all just human beings trying to survive in a world that had temporarily gone insane. In the weeks and months that followed that watershed evening, the entire atmosphere at Fort Deschler underwent a profound transformation. The prisoners began eating what was served to them without question or hesitation. The tension that had permeated every interaction gradually dissipated, replaced by something approaching normalcy, or at least the particular kind of normalcy that was possible in a prisoner facility. It was not friendship exactly, not between the guards and the guarded, but it was mutual respect, mutual recognition of shared humanity. The WAC personnel stopped seeing the German women as dangerous enemies who needed constant vigilance, and the prisoners stopped seeing their captors as monsters waiting for an excuse to inflict cruelty. They were just groups of women thrust together by circumstances beyond their control, making the best of an awkward situation. Lieutenant Jacobs's unorthodox solution had worked in ways that went beyond simply solving the immediate problem of refused meals. She had demonstrated something important about the nature of power and authority, about the limits of command and the possibilities of empathy. She had shown that sometimes the most effective response to fear was not force or logic or demonstration of power, but simple, authentic humanity. She had understood, perhaps intuitively, that before you could feed someone's body, you had to nourish their ability to trust, had to create conditions where they felt safe enough to be vulnerable. The soup had been a vehicle for that trust, a medium through which humanity could be transmitted across boundaries of language and nationality and wartime propaganda. Captain Miller never mentioned the soup incident again in any official capacity, but his weekly reports to higher command noted with bureaucratic satisfaction that there had been a marked and significant improvement in prisoner health and morale, attributing this positive development to effective camp management practices under the leadership of Lieutenant Jacobs and her staff. The reports made no mention of potato soup or kitchen experiments, maintained the careful fiction that everything had been accomplished through proper procedure and appropriate application of regulations. Sergeant Henderson, for her part, was primarily satisfied with the dramatic reduction in food waste that followed the resolution of the crisis. Her pragmatic mind, focused always on efficiency and proper resource allocation, could appreciate the outcome, even if the methodology had seemed bizarre and contrary to every principle of military organization she held dear. Waste had been eliminated, supplies were being used appropriately, and her kitchen was running smoothly again. Those were the metrics that mattered to her, and by those metrics, the problem had been solved successfully. For Greta Fischer, the experience marked a quiet but profound turning point in her understanding of the world and her place in it. She continued to serve as a liaison between the prisoners and the camp administration, continued to be the voice that the other women looked to when they needed guidance or representation. But the hard edge of cynicism that had characterized her in those first difficult days was gone, worn away by the simple act of being treated with unexpected decency. She and Jacobs would occasionally speak, not frequently but often enough, conversations that gradually shifted from formal exchanges about camp business to something approaching genuine dialogue between two intelligent women who found themselves on opposite sides of a historical moment they were now forced to navigate together. They would never be friends exactly, the circumstances made that impossible, but there was mutual respect and mutual recognition that circumstances had made them temporary allies in the unglamorous work of maintaining basic human dignity in difficult circumstances. The camp at Fort Deschler, like so many other temporary installations scattered across the American interior, was never intended to be permanent. It was a holding facility, a way station in the vast, complicated machinery of post-war processing. By early 1946, as the weather turned cold and the first real peacetime began to take shape, most of the German prisoners held in the United States, including the women of the Helferinnenkorps, were finally repatriated back to Europe. They boarded trains and then ships, making the long journey in reverse, crossing back over the Atlantic to a continent that had been fundamentally transformed by 6 years of total war. They returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the country they had left. The cities they remembered had been reduced to rubble. The infrastructure was shattered. Millions were dead or displaced. The country itself had been divided between occupying powers, split into zones of control that would eventually harden into separate states. Food was scarce in ways that made wartime rationing seem generous by comparison. Starvation was a real and present threat for millions of civilians trying to survive in the ruins. The abundance they had witnessed in America, the casual plenty of that mess hall in Pennsylvania, must have seemed like something from a dream, like a vision of an alternate reality that was almost impossible to reconcile with the devastation they now faced. Lieutenant Anna Jacobs served out the remainder of her commission, completing her term of service as the camp gradually wound down its operations and finally closed in the spring of 1946. She received a commendation for her service, a formal citation that mentioned her exemplary leadership and innovative problem-solving, but provided no specific details about potato soup or psychological breakthroughs. When her discharge papers were finally processed, she returned to civilian life in Ohio, going back to the small town where she had grown up, returning to the high school where she had taught before the war. She resumed her career teaching history to teenagers, but she was not quite the same person who had left for officer training all those years earlier. Her perspective had been forever altered by the experience of living through history rather than reading about it in textbooks. She had learned things about human nature and power and the complicated mechanics of trust that no academic study could have taught her. She rarely spoke about her time at Fort Deschler, found that most people were not particularly interested in stories about prisoner camps for German women, preferred to focus on more dramatic narratives of combat and liberation. But she never forgot what she had witnessed in that mess hall, never forgot the sight of 400 women weeping over simple bowls of potato soup, never forgot the way that the most powerful weapon sometimes turned out to be not force but unexpected kindness. It was a lesson that stayed with her for the rest of her life, that informed how she taught her students about war and peace and the complicated nature of history. She would tell them, when the opportunity arose, that sometimes the most important moments in history are not the great battles or the dramatic speeches or the signing of treaties. Sometimes the most important moments happen in quiet places like mess halls and kitchens, moments when people manage to recognize each other's humanity across all the barriers that war and politics have erected. Those moments cannot win wars, she would say, cannot change the grand sweep of events, but they can sometimes begin the difficult work of mending a world that has been broken. That work is less dramatic than combat, but no less essential, and it requires different kinds of courage, different kinds of strength. If someone had asked her years later what the most important thing she did during the war was, she might have pointed not to any administrative accomplishment or logistical success, but to that single afternoon in a kitchen, making soup while a German prisoner watched and slowly began to understand that everything she had been told about the enemy was wrong. That moment of recognition, that crumbling of propaganda's wall, that first tentative step toward trust, that was the thing worth remembering. That was the story that mattered, even if it would never make it into the history books, even if it would be forgotten by everyone except the women who lived through it. Small acts of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. That was what made the difference. That was what allowed people to remain human, even when the world seemed determined to strip away their humanity. It was not a grand lesson, not the kind of thing that could be captured in slogans or commemorated with monuments, but it was true, and truth was what mattered in the end, even when the truth was as simple as a bowl of soup shared between enemies who were learning to see each other as something more.